key concept 3.4 focuses on the European states and how they struggle to maintain stability during this age of nationalism and the age of revolutions. After the Congress of Vienna, the Concert of Europe, what we call the Congress system, sought to maintain the status quo through collective action and adherence to conservatism. First of all, part of that understanding of that also is that during the Congress of Vienna, during Metternich's time, it was guided by three principles: legitimacy, containment, and balance of power. Legitimacy ensured restoring the legitimate monarchs to their crowns, so thus the restoration of the Bourbons in both France and Spain, as well as some of the smaller German states and the restoration of their monarchs. Containment meant to contain France, to keep it from expanding, and balance of power to make sure that no one country would get too powerful. And this was most important through the actions of the Quadruple Alliance. The Quadruple Alliance included the four victorious powers of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Britain. In 1818, France joined, renaming it the Quintuple Alliance, and this created what we call the concert system. This concert system essentially made sure that the five major powers of Europe were allied together, and they would put down international rebellions. They would put down revolts. They would maintain, or try to maintain, ideas that were opposed to liberalism and nationalism. And ultimately, we're going to see conservative control of Europe during this period from 1815 through 1848. However, despite this conservative control, there were many attempts at revolution, and revolutions and revolts attempted to destroy the status quo. So a few of them that we'll talk about before the big ones. First of all, the Greek War. We talked about that in our last review, and if you remember, this was during the 1820s as the Greeks were revolting from the Ottomans for independence. The Council of Europe decided to give backing to the Greeks and accept Greek independence, but a German monarch was put on the Greek throne upon independence in 1829. Another revolt that took place during this time was a revolt in Russia called the Decembrist Revolt. Alexander I, the leader of Russia during Napoleon's invasion and Russia's representative at the Congress of Vienna, became more conservative throughout his reign. And by 1825, when he died, the fear of a prospective autocratic regime of Nicholas I scared many. The army preferred Nicholas's brother Constantine, who was thought to be more favorable to the innovations of the state. However, Constantine had renounced the throne, and there was the confusion caused by that led to a mass revolt by a group called the Northern Union, more popularly known as the Decembrists. This revolt was quickly put down. Many of the Decembrists had been officers, like I said, in the army. They were severely punished, and Nicholas I ushers in a regime that from 1825 through 1855, when he died, became more and more repressive. There were secret police, as well as the fact that not only were they more repressive, but they just failed to modernize during that time period. And during that 30-year period, many of the European states are industrializing and making some changes, while Russia retains its status quo, which is going to set them further behind by the Crimean War. Metternich supposedly said that when France sneezes, Europe catches a cold. And we're going to see that in the years 1830 and 1848. These are the 2 years of revolution. I always call it 1830 a year of revolutions. I always call it 1848 the year of revolutions. But both sets of revolutions began in France. And so the French Revolution of 1830, let's give a little background about that. The French Bourbon monarchy was restored as a limited monarchy with Louis XVIII. And when Louis XVIII died in 1824, Charles X became the new leader. Louis XVIII was very mindful of the French Revolution and accepted the Napoleonic heritage. There was no return of property to church or nobles. There was a fair distribution of the tax burden in a bicameral legislature. And although it wasn't exactly a democracy, it did protect the French people from a return to absolutism and aristocratic privilege. When Charles X inherited the throne in 1824, he tried to reestablish that old order. He had been the leader of the émigrés during the Revolution. He supported a more prominent role for the nobility and especially a more prominent role for the church. To make matters worse, this was a time of economic hardship in France, and Charles was trying to dissolve the Assembly. And this leads to the spark of the Revolution of 1830 in France, the July Ordinances. Also known as the Four Ordinances, Charles called for stricter censorship of the press, as well as curtailing voting rights for the middle classes. He also called for new elections to the Chamber of Deputies, and workers took their grievances to the street in July 1830. Charles called for the mobilization of the army against the workers. However, the army refused to fire on the crowd. Charles was forced to flee to England, and a branch of the Bourbon family, the Orleans family, created a new king named Louis Philippe, known as the Citizen King. The French Revolution, though, did spread into other areas, into Belgium, for example. A dislike of Dutch rule and the use of Dutch instead of French led to a Belgian revolt, and the continent of Europe agreed to Belgian independence with the guarantee of neutrality. The Poles also revolted during this time period. Officially, Poland was independent, this time period known as Congress Poland, and Nicholas I, however, was the King of Poland. Although officially independent, the reality was that Poland was under Russia's control. This Polish result was a disaster. The Poles themselves were divided. There was no assistance from anyone in Western Europe. And once the Russian army entered Poland, it essentially collapsed. And the outcome, there was no such thing as Congress Poland. At this point, there was no illusion of Polish independence. It was simply absorbed into the Russian Empire. And finally, there were some failed revolts in the Italian states during this time period as well. I think Modena, Parma, and others as well. And with these failed results, we're going to see continued dominance of Italy by the Austrian Empire. As I said earlier, the revolutions generally started in France and spread to the other countries, and the revolutions of 1848 were no exception. Louis Philippe, the Citizen King, had brought about electoral reform. However, it was the middle class, or the bourgeoisie, that was favored during this time period. There was also the beginnings of some serious industrialization in France, which is going to lead to a very vibrant worker class. And by 1848, when Louis refuses to bring about electoral reform, we're going to see a working class revolt in Paris, which is going to lead to the establishment of a provisional republic and the end of the French monarchy. The leader of the provisional government, Louis Blanc, a socialist, granted universal male suffrage and other reforms, and his great idea was for something called national workshops. Essentially, these were public works programs which would guarantee employment to the working poor. Unfortunately, by June, when this ran out of money and the workshops were canceled, we're going to see a revolt, which is going to lead to the death of 10,000 and lead the French to basically begin to draft a republican constitution. In December of 1848, as tensions calmed down, a dark horse candidate, Louis Napoleon, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, would be elected president, and later on he'd become Emperor Napoleon III. But as I said, these revolutions also spread. In Prussia, middle-class Prussians wanted to create a unified liberal Germany, and the working-class people of Prussia demanded a constitution. They revolted in Berlin. These ideas spread through the German states, and from May of 1848 through May of 1849, delegates from all over the German states met at Frankfurt and tried to create a unified German state with a constitution. However, the Prussian king, Frederick William IV, refused to accept any crown. The delegates were not really representative of any organized group. There was an unclear definition of Germany. And the fact that the Prussians did not want a liberal democracy or constitutional monarchy as well. And it essentially failed. We're going to see German unification delayed another 20 or so years. The revolution in France also resulted in popular upheaval throughout the Austrian Empire, and Hungarian nationalism revolted in revolution against the Austrian overlords. A man named Louis Kossuth led the revolt and ultimately briefly established an independent Hungary. The Hungarian revolt was only finally put down in 1849 when the Russians intervened on behalf of the Austrians, and Hungary regained the Austrian Empire. The 1848 revolts also, though, were throughout the rest of the empire, the Bohemians, the Slavs as well, and essentially the Austrian Empire was able to use these revolts against the subject nationalities, and the revolts will soon collapse. The Italians also revolt from the Austrians, and once again, there was a brief Roman Republic founded by Giuseppe Mazzini. This also was put down. The only real success for the subjects of the Austrian Empire was the fact that Metternich was forced to flee. But the Austrian Empire remains intact by the end of the 1848 revolutions with the help of Russia, but in a greatly weakened state, which is going to lead to some severe problems in the second half of the 19th century. And overall, while the revolutions of 1848 failed to achieve their democratic, nationalistic, and republican ends, they did leave a lasting mark on European politics. Liberalism and nationalism would still continue to grow, and in fact, in the second half of the century, conservatives are going to embrace nationalism as we see a realpolitik and intervention emerge as central aspects of statecraft as a result of these failed revolutions. Okay. In addition, these failed revolutions led to the breakdown of the continent of Europe. Between really, historians are divided. Some say the revolutions of 1848 led to the end of the continent of Europe. Most definitely, though, by the end of the Crimean War, we will see a breakdown of the continent of Europe, and it's going to open the door for movements of national unification in Italy, Germany, as well as liberal reforms elsewhere. The Crimean War from 1853 to 1856 resulted in a loss for the Russian Empire, but also showed the weakness of the Ottoman Empire. Very briefly, the Crimean War began in 1853 when Russia decided to occupy some of the Danubian principalities along the Black Sea and the Danube River in the Balkans that had been part of the Ottoman territory. The European powers rejected this, and by 1854, Britain and France, along with Sardinia, went to war against the Russian Empire and giving assistance to the Ottomans. Reasons are interesting. The French wanted to restore their military power. They had been insulted about that they had been snubbed as protectors of the Christians in the Ottoman Empire as their official reason to go to war against Russia, and the Russians were going to assume for that. But ultimately, they really wanted to restore their power in Europe, show that they were military power under Napoleon III. The Sardinians wanted allies for a possible future bid at Italian unification against the Austrians. And the British just simply wanted to maintain the balance of power. They didn't want a Russian expansion of the Black Sea. The war itself was a crushing loss for the Russians. 2/3 of all dead were Russians. And the war, like I said, definitively ended the continent of Europe and allowed for German and Italian unification. The war also is going to help contribute to major reforms in Russia, display the weakness. This was the first war the Russians had lost in about 150 years, since the time of Peter the Great. As I said earlier, conservatives are going to embrace nationalism in the second half of the 19th century. And one of the best examples of this embracing of nationalism by conservatives is that of Napoleon III in France. Louis Napoleon had been elected as the president of the Second French Republic, and for the most part, was dedicated to law and order and the eradication of socialism and so forth. However, Louis did believe the government should represent the people and it should try to help them economically. But he was also very concerned with his own fame and vanity. And in 1851, the Constitution essentially did not allow Louis to run for re-election. Louis tried to change the Constitution and he was denied. And as a result, he is going to essentially seize the throne. A year later, 97% of the population agree in a plebiscite to make him a hereditary emperor. And by 1852, he becomes known as Emperor Napoleon III. As far as some of his strategies and his ideas, his first of all, a little bit of history. So from 1852 through 1860, his control was pretty direct and authoritarian. Uh, there was a National Assembly of sorts, but they didn't have much power, and there were secret police, and opposition parties were generally not allowed. However, Napoleon III, ever the opportunist, recognized that change was coming, and the second part of his regime, from 1860 through 1870, is known as the Liberal Empire. And it's during this time where basically he allows more freedoms of speech. He allows progressive liberal reforms. He extends the powers of the Legislative Assembly. He gives opposition candidates greater freedom. Napoleon III took parliamentary elections very seriously because it told him the mood of the people. During that liberal empire, he permitted the development of trade unions. He permitted the right to strike. He eased on censorship. He granted amnesty to political prisoners. And as a result of this, he had great support for domestic policies. Additionally, his greatest successes were in the economy. He became, like I said, popular because of internal improvements. He built highways, canals, railway construction, and living conditions in France generally improved during his time period. Spoken about earlier, major public works programs included the rebuilding of the city of Paris as well. Napoleon's downfall, however, came with foreign policy struggles, and this increased criticism of Napoleon III and ultimately led to his being captured as a POW in the Franco-Prussian War. While successful in the Crimean War, he had promised to help Cavour and the Sardinians obtain Italian unification, and he was met there with mixed success. He promised to help Cavour get back Lombardy and Venetia. He was able to get Cavour Lombardy, but then he withdrew his troops. In turn, he did get Nice as well as Savoy from the Italians, and so there's a partial success there. However, after that, he tried to occupy Mexico under the Archduke Maximilian, who he appointed as Mexican emperor. This failed pretty miserably, and in 1870 was goaded into declaring war on Prussia by Bismarck, a disaster for Napoleon, and led to this Franco-Prussian War actually led to the end of the Second French Empire and the beginning of the Third Republic. In addition, we're going to see conservatives during this time embrace nationalism, particularly the realpolitik strategies of both Cavour and Garibaldi in Italy, as well as realpolitik for Bismarck and the unification of Germany. A little bit about Italian unification, some background. I said earlier in an earlier review that in 1848 there were failed revolutions in Italy. One of the early Italian nationalists, Giuseppe Mazzini, had actually formed a Roman Republic, and this movement was unsuccessful, didn't last. And Cavour, pictured in the middle of this picture of the image here, will emerge as the architect of Italian unification. And the whole Italian peninsula, part of it was really an accident. Cavour had really only wanted to unify the northern part of the Italian peninsula. He was the prime minister of Sardinia, and he had helped build Sardinia, or also known as Piedmont Sardinia, depending on what your textbook says, into a liberal and economically sound state. It was a constitutional monarchy. He worked throughout the 1850s to consolidate Sardinia as a leading Italian state. And he essentially joined the Crimean War in order to gain allies against Austria. And with French aid in 1859, he went to war with Austria and was able to get the area known as Lombardy back, which is where present-day Milan and northern Italy. He was unsuccessful getting Venice, but this success in Milan led to several of the areas of northern and central Italy to revolt from the Austrians and ask to join up with the Kingdom of Sardinia, which they successfully did. In the meantime, Garibaldi, pictured on the right, very famous romantic nationalist who had taken part in the revolutions of 1848, had actually fled to South America where he did some guerrilla fighting and then was a baker in Brooklyn, had heard all about this and got on the first boat back to the Italian peninsula. Not part of Cavour's plan, Garibaldi invaded southern Italy with his red shirts and marched up through the peninsula heading towards Rome. This made Cavour somewhat nervous, and Cavour actually had to send troops to stop Garibaldi. The problem with Rome was that the Pope was opposed to Italian unification, and the French were bound to protect the Pope, and Cavour did not want to risk war with the Pope. Thus, the realpolitik, the reality of not taking Rome in a unified Italy. Garibaldi's military strategies, however, did enable southern Italy to join up with northern Italy, as he gave it to King Victor Emmanuel, and in 1861 the Kingdom of Italy was proclaimed, with Venice and Rome missing. Cavour soon thereafter died. However, in 1866 the Italians get Venice because of a war with Austria and that they allied with Prussia, and in 1871, as a result of the Franco-Prussian War, they're able to gain Rome as their capital. The church will remain opposed to Italian unification until the 1920s, when Mussolini makes an agreement known as Lateran Treaty with them. We're also going to see the unification of Germany during this time period, and this will be done largely through the actions of Otto von Bismarck and the policies of realpolitik. So a little bit about Germany before Bismarck, or Prussia before Bismarck. The German states were still locked in a political stalemate after the 1848 revolutions, and the Zollverein had become a crucial factor in Prussian leadership. But the question of unification even before 1848 was whether to have Kleindeutsch or Großdeutsch, small Germany or big Germany. Big Germany would include Austria, the Habsburg Empire. Small Germany would not. And ultimately, with the revolutions of 1848, Kleindeutsch became the mode for a German unification. Austria was increasingly excluded from German politics. And as Bismarck became Chancellor of Prussia, his main goal was to strengthen Prussia's power and status. He used nationalism for his own convenience, and his own view is that middle-class liberalism was not the way to unify Germany, but not by speeches and votes of the majority are the great questions of the day decided, but by iron and blood. Thus the policy of realpolitik. He used the Zollverein to undermine Austrian economic influence, and he helped unite Germany through both war and diplomacy. Many attribute Bismarck as kind of a warmonger, and he did use war, but he was actually very clever about war. Before he went to war, he made it a point to isolate his enemies and was able to be quite successful. So the three wars that helped to unite Germany were wars with Denmark, Austria, and France. And so the first war, the Danish War, Bismarck convinced Austria to ally with him. They went to war over a region called Schleswig-Holstein, and they easily defeated the Danes. That was in 1864, and 2 years later, war broke out between Austria and Prussia, known as the 7 Weeks' War, or the Austro-Prussian War, or the German Civil War, but it basically was over administrative differences in regard to Schleswig-Holstein. Most of the northern states allied with Prussia, and the southern states of Bavaria and Württemberg allied with Austria. Prussia easily defeated Austria, and as a result, Austria withdraws from German politics. The German Confederation, in fact, is dissolved, and instead a new North German Confederation led by Prussia is formed. Bismarck was very clever in his treaties. Austria only lost Venice to Italy for its assistance, otherwise generally didn't lose much else. The southern states that supported Austria, Bavaria, and Württemberg, the only result of the treaty with them was that if Germany or Prussia was attacked by a non-German state, that they would give military assistance, which they later would do in very minute numbers. And so we see really, for all practical purposes, North Germany united. Southern Germany was still somewhat nervous about it. Like I said, Bavaria, part of it was that they were Catholic, they feared domination by Prussia, and this continued. And Bismarck knew that war was needed to bring the southern German states into the German Union. And so in 1870, he manipulated the French into declaring war on Prussia. And as we said, during this war, he used the railways very advantageously. He used industrialized weaponry like the Krupp cannon. And, after he was basically able to very quickly defeats French forces. He brought an end to Napoleon III's Second French Empire. Napoleon III had been captured as POW. And as a result of the Franco-Prussian War, the German Empire was proclaimed in January 1871. And to add insult to injury, it was proclaimed at Versailles during that time period. The new constitution granted Germans the external trappings of democratic politics, but not their substance. There was a Reichstag, but sovereignty rested with the emperor and his chancellor, Bismarck. For the most part, Germany remained an absolute empire and did become a major power both militarily and economically as a result of this unification during this time period. Nationalism also affected the Austrian Empire. As I stated earlier, the Habsburgs were able to crush the revolutions of 1848 and 49. But despite that, we're going to see, this subject nationality still wanting independence. And, the most serious group to contend with were the Hungarians. They were the most powerful group. And after the Austro-Prussian War, the Austrians were forced to make a deal with the Hungarians, thus the creation of the dual monarchy, the Compromise of 1867, in which the Emperor of Austria now became the King of Hungary as well. Both Austria and Hungary remained independent regarding domestic affairs, despite the same monarch, but they had a common army, they had a common foreign policy, common economic system, and a common system of defense. What this did, however, while it did heal the issue of the Hungarians revolting, the nationality problem still persisted, especially because we're going to see further suppression of the Slavic minorities, and particularly in Hungarian areas. Another country that's going to embrace liberal reforms through a conservative authoritarian style will be Russia. The Crimean War basically showed the Russians how far behind they had become, and Tsar Nicholas I died in 1855. Alexander II inherited the throne and decided to get Russia out of the war. He also, as a result of the war, recognized that they had to reform Russia, and we're going to see several reforms of Alexander, the most notable being the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. Essentially, Alexander had to, discuss with the boyars and said that if we don't reform from within, it's going to be reformed through revolution, and he was able to convince them. The problem with the serfs and the freedom of the serfs was that the peasants were still bound to the land through collective ownership. The boyars were forced to sell portions of their land, often the least developed portions, the ones that had the most difficult time growing stuff. And these huge, known as the mir, these peasants still had these huge obligations to them, but technically they were free, and we are going to see some peasants were able to leave and settle in cities, thus beginning some industrialization in Russia. We're also going to see a time of greater freedoms in Russia. Intellectuals were allowed to speak out, and they might speak out a bit too much, as we know that they become increasingly unhappy. They want more than Alexander's able to give during this time period. We're going to also see the creation of zemstvos, which were elected local assemblies, and some judicial reforms. And once again, Russia remains autocratic, but we are going to see at least some semblance of local government in which ordinary people are able to participate throughout the country. We'll see some industrialization, most notably the railroads that are being built, and Russia emerging during this time period. And while Russia does begin this period of industrialization, it's not enough to really keep up with the West, but more than had been done before. And finally, like I said, many were unsatisfied with the reforms of Alexander. A terrorist organization called the Will of the People succeeded and assassinated Alexander in 1881. Subsequent leader, Alexander III, actually reversed many of Alexander's policies, began imprisoning those that were opposed to the regime, and his policies, as well as his successor, Nicholas II, are going to lead to the Russian Revolution of 1905. In this revolution, sparked by losses in the Russo-Japanese War and food shortages, Workers are going to march to the Winter Palace expecting, a very peaceful protest. In fact, they were singing God Save the Tsar during their march. Palace guards, perhaps confused, opened fire on them. This event, Bloody Sunday, led to massive revolution throughout the country, and the result of this revolution throughout the country was that Nicholas II was forced by the end of 1905 in his October Manifesto to create a Russian parliament called the Duma, a legislative system. The Duma, briefly successful with universal male suffrage in 1905, had basically failed to have any power at all by 1906 and was little more than a debating club. And so while the Duma briefly satisfied the revolutionaries, we're going to see discontent continue to grow in Russia, ultimately erupting in revolution in 1917. The unification of Italy and Germany transformed the European balance of power and led to efforts to construct a new diplomatic order. After the defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War, not only was the German Empire proclaimed at Versailles, but Germany took the area known as Alsace-Lorraine. This is going to cause a rivalry that continues through World War I between the Germans and the French. The French wanted revenge for the Franco-Prussian War, and the Germans were determined to keep the French weak and unable to get their revenge. This is best exemplified through Bismarck's alliance system. Recognizing that the French wanted revenge, Bismarck began a series of alliances in order to keep France isolated. First, the Three Emperors League in 1873 between Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. Then the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary, and later the triple alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy will solidify this keeping France isolated. However, rivalries between Austria-Hungary and Russia that developed throughout the 1880s over the Balkans and the Slavic areas of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire are going to complicate this alliance. And by 1887, Austria refuses to renew the Three Emperors League. Thus, the Germans signed what was known as the Reinsurance Treaty with Russia. Once again, looking at the chart, you can see that France remained isolated. Britain was in its period of what we call splendid isolation, and the French, while building up their military, had no direct ally. Unfortunately, in 1890, the new German Kaiser Wilhelm II decided to dismiss Bismarck. Feeling that the Reinsurance Treaty violated the spirit of the German-Austrian alliance, in 1894, In 1894, Russia and France signed an alliance together, and later joined by Great Britain in 1907, it becomes known as the Triple Entente. So we have two rival alliances by 1914, the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, and the Triple Entente of Great Britain, France, and Russia. To further complicate matters, nationalistic tensions in the Balkans, known as the powder keg of Europe, were increasing as well. The weakness of the Ottoman Empire led to the creation of several new states, such as Serbia, Montenegro, etc. And the Austrian first occupation of Bosnia and later annexation of Bosnia is going to exacerbate these issues. And so overall, Europe by 1914 was really in a mess. The Balkans were just waiting to explode. The Slavs within the Austro-Hungarian Empire were wanting to revolt and wanting independence. And the assassination of the Archduke will give the excuse that many of these countries want in order to go to war, a concept we'll talk about in our next one in a later review. This is it for Key Concept 3.4. Our next review will be on Key Concept 3.5, the European Age of Imperialism.